Addressing an issue of performance, behaviour or attendance is difficult, but you can optimise your chances for success if you prepare, identify specific evidence of the problem, find the right space and time to hold the conversation, and listen well before agreeing a plan of action. Very few of us want to have those difficult conversations, but by planning, listening and allowing people to identify their own ways to improve, you're more likely to ensure their future engagement as well as an improvement. We'll focus on all of those things as the training progresses. What constitutes a problem in the workplace for you? Performance and behaviour can be very subjective, and what's unacceptable for one person might not bother somebody else. Consistency is the key. It's important that people see you demonstrate consistent decision making, and you don't treat your work pals differently to other people in the team that you're not so friendly with. That approach can present challenges if you need to have a more difficult conversation with a staff member. A less consistent approach that you might adopt because you're trying to be friendly may well undermine you further down the line. It's not to suggest that you manage your teams rigidly. Line management discretion and flexibility are important, as individuals all need a slightly different approach. Working in line with your organisational policies and not showing favouritism earns you the respect required when situations need a very formal response. A problem or issue can be defined as either a performance problem, such as unacceptable standards of work, tasks not being completed, or deadlines not being met. A behavioural problem, such as poor attitude to colleagues, a disruptive presence in the work environment, or a disrespectful approach to clients. An attendance problem, such as coming in late or leaving early with no explanation, increasing sickness absence, or taking unauthorised leave. You can define requirements of performance in a performance plan. Use the individual's job description to define the key responsibilities of their role as the basis for the plan. The job description's quite general though, so just use it as a guide for more specific objectives. We'll talk more about how you can do that in Chapter 7 of the course. Expectations of behaviour can come from a defined organisational culture and values, which some of the larger corporate organisations have. But in smaller organisations, those expectations will be defined by your role model behaviours, your behaviours and those of more senior staff. Think about when you joined a new organisation. Those were the people that you observed, weren't they, to get the lay of the land in terms of behaviours. If you demonstrate fabulous role model behaviours but other senior people don't, your progress could be undermined. So that might be another difficult conversation you need to have. There's always more to do, isn't there? Expectations of attendance can be defined in an attendance policy. If flexible working is available in your organisation, your policy can state the core hours people are expected to work. If your core hours are 10 a.m. to 4 p.m, for instance, and a staff member keeps making medical appointments earlier in the afternoon, you can confirm the policy is in place to allow a level of equality across the team and organisation. A flexible working policy gives flexibility for things like medical appointments, so repeated appointments earlier in the day shouldn't be required. You might view an 11:30 appointment with a specialist consultant slightly differently to regular appointments with a GP. You have the discretion to decide, but the policy supports you to hold people to account if they're working outside of the policy requirements. An attendance policy can also define leave allowances and options for unpaid leave if the need arises. Thinking about your workplace values, what's important to you? Punctuality might be really important to you, but if you have a member of staff who has caring responsibilities for a relative and so needs some flexibility on what time they start work, a less rigid approach is appropriate. A conversation is usually enough to diffuse any anxieties on both sides, so it's important to have those conversations with your teams. Get to know them and a little bit about their lives so you know what reasonable adjustments can be helpful. Your flexibility can secure your team's continued commitment and engagement. Win-win. Is it acceptable to swear in your workplace? The use of strong language can be a very emotive subject. And when we become stressed, angry or frustrated, we can use words that help to get rid of those emotional feelings. But is that acceptable for everyone? Or is there one rule for one work area and another rule for another work area? Would you like your reception team to use strong language with each other as a customer or someone coming in for an interview walks into your reception area? Is it acceptable for people to use strong language that can be overheard if a colleague's on the phone? Ultimately, it's down to your personal values, but it might be worth having a conversation with your team about it to make an agreement. Don't impose your rules without a discussion. That will just frustrate people. Give them the opportunity to express their views. And if 9 out of 10 people in the team aren't worried about the use of strong language, just be more mindful about using it around the one person who does mind. Be seen to respect their preference and talk about where strong language is unacceptable. If a member of staff excels in one area, in their performance for instance, but their behaviours are unacceptable, you might be more reluctant to tackle the behavioural problem as that might impact on their performance. But if you don't tackle the problem, you'll almost certainly be storing up trouble for a future time. People who don't behave well are often waiting for someone to tackle them about it. It can be a form of attention seeking. So if you don't tackle their behaviour, it's likely to escalate over time. They've not been challenged, so they feel they've been given the green light to continue to behave badly. Whilst the individual might feel they're being given the okay to behave in a certain way, you're also sending a strong message to the staff members around them to confirm that you're not prepared to tackle the behaviour. If you then try to tackle an issue with someone else, the example of the other person's behaviour will almost certainly be used against you and will weaken your argument for the behaviours you expect to see. I see Louise doing that all the time. She never seems to get told off. If you believe there's a problem with someone's performance, behaviour or attendance, talk to them to find out if there's a reason as to why the situation is presenting itself. You might say, "Are you okay? You don't seem your usual chirpy self," or something suitably supportive. Alternatively, if the issue is significant, you might need a firmer approach. "I need to speak to you about how you were with Sue yesterday. That's not acceptable. What was going on there?" If you want to challenge an individual's performance, you'll need specific examples of when and how they've not met yours or the organisation's expectations of their performance. That's when your organisational policies can be so important. If you have clear definitions of what's expected, you can clearly state why the person's performance or behaviour isn't acceptable. You might say, "I heard how you spoke to Rob the other day and I don't feel that you were respectful in how you did that. We're committed to treating each other respectfully here. It's defined as part of our culture. So can you talk to me about what was going on?" It might be that Rob has been underperforming for some time and his colleagues are getting frustrated with correcting his mistakes and dealing with his unhappy customers. So that's why the conversation went as it did. You might then talk about how Rob's performance is being challenged and addressed, but how it's important to demonstrate role model behaviours at all times, even in the most frustrating of situations. Staying calm is actually more effective. Approach conversations with an open mind, particularly if the behaviour is out of character for that person. If you give people the time and space to explain what's happening, they'll usually do that. Sometimes behaviours are normalised over time. Instead of being addressed, the line manager avoids tackling the issues. We might hear things like, "Oh, don't worry about Rob, he's always like that, just ignore him." You may well know a few of those. I know I certainly do. The issue is that as a staff member is not performing, either in terms of their work or their behaviour, there is an impact on their colleagues. If that issue isn't seen to be dealt with, your staff will have a view on how they think you should act and how they would deal with things if it were them. Ultimately, that means your staff are losing respect for your leadership, and so they may well start to disengage as a result. By not challenging poor performance, behaviour or attendance, you're implying that something is acceptable, so other staff might follow suit. "Well, it doesn't matter if you keep coming in late, apparently. I'm going to start doing that then." People who aren't performing in their roles or are behaving badly can be intimidating to talk to. It can be challenging to address those issues. People usually know when they're behaving badly though, so if you're brave enough to call them out on it, they'll often moderate their behaviour very quickly, especially if they get bored of being spoken to about it all the time. Next steps. Think about how yours and the organisation's expectations of your staff's performance, behaviour and attendance are defined. Do you have policies, defined values and performance plans to back you up if you need to challenge an issue? Any difficult conversation will be made easier if you do. As behaviours are less tangible, it can be a great team meeting conversation to define what your acceptable and unacceptable behaviours will be. That conversation alone might help to hold a few people to account. That's the end of this session. After a break, you're ready to move on to the next presentation to think about the importance of demonstrating role model behaviours.